Finding Community in the Age of Uncertainty and Enshittification. This presentation was delivered at the virtual Tiny Home Show on January 18th, 2025. Hello everyone, thank you for being here today. So before we get started, I'd like to make a couple disclaimers. The first is that no, I did not make up the term Enshittification. That would be Canadian tech journalist Cory Doctorow, who coined it in 2022. He described enshittification as the gradual deterioration of a service or product brought about by a reduction in quality and as a consequence of profit seeking. It kind of struck a nerve in the zeitgeist and was the Macquarie Dictionary's word of the year last year. The second disclaimer is that, despite the provocative title, I hope to leave you with a sense of inspiration and excitement about finding community. To do that, I'm going to stray onto topics you might not have expected to encounter on a Saturday morning at a tiny home show. Not just homesteading, but also things like emergence, co-creation, and adaptation. Why? Because they're actually all related and relevant to community. And also because I've picked up a few insights from a meandering career that spanned the creative arts and tech toys, but also mental health and disaster management. I've learned that sometimes inspiration comes from odd combinations. Sometimes the best things are found when you look off the main trail. Sometimes the greatest gifts are found in uneasy places. So let's start there. I used to lead a disaster and emergency management startup. This is younger me presenting 10 years ago at the World Conference on Disaster Management. My unusual presentation was called The Herd of Cats: How Entrepreneurs, Improvisers, and Disaster Managers Approach an Uncertain World. It was, I guess, like this presentation, a bit of a synthesis of seemingly disparate ideas. And if you're interested in watching the whole thing, there's a recording of it posted at bigcalm.ca. In it, I covered the usual stuff, like VUCA. That's the military acronym for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. All things that I think we can agree are increasing. But among other things, I also highlighted a lesser-known idea by British educator Eddie Obeng called the world after midnight. Very briefly, it goes like this. We humans are learners, and our learning, of course, is growing over time. At the same time, because of population growth, urbanization, and technology like the internet, we've increased speed, scale, and the density of interaction. Even more so now with AI. The rate of change is accelerating faster than our pace of learning. The point where these two lines cross is what Obeng called midnight, and he argued that midnight already happened around 2000. Before midnight, in the old world, our approach was to plan, analyze, and predict. Things moved slower, the experts had all the answers, and failure just wasn't acceptable. After midnight, in the new world, the approach is quite different. We don't have all the answers. Nobody does. It's simply no longer humanly possible. We're just cluing into this. As Obeng put it, we spend our time responding rationally to a world which we understand and recognize, but which no longer exists. Instead, we need to collectively make sense of what's actually emerging and then think by doing. Adapt. Well, that's improv. This is me again 10 years ago, this time with a class at Montreal Improv Theatre. And I should add that I'm an introvert, and this was certainly outside of my comfort zone. Now in my herd of cats talk, I'd present this photo to disaster management pros, and they'd cringe. I remember at one conference during a simple creative exercise just with pipe cleaners, a bunch of older men sitting cross-armed at the back of the conference room, too curious to leave but too set in their ways to participate. Nobody goes to a disaster conference to play, they'd say. But applied improv, as it's called, not stage performance but just the principles, is actually a very useful mindset and approach to emergence. Applied improv can phenomenally accelerate the connection between people, to listen to each other, to listen for signals, to embrace the facts of the real world, and do so with humor. Most people think improv is just winging it, but it's not. Improv folks actually have a whole bunch of rules. or let's say guidelines. For example, be prepared. Know your strengths and weaknesses and those of the other players. Know the stage, if there are props, and who's in the audience. Just show up. Simply being there matters. When there, be in the now. Be present. Then observe and listen actively. Follow your foot. That's a phrase that means that if you're leaning into a scene, go all in and participate. Don't sit cross-armed and judgmental. Accept all offers and inputs. Improvisers call these gifts. Be average. Surprisingly, it's the actors and comedians who struggle most with improv because they want to be the stars. But just be average. Roll with mistakes, keep the energy, and make others look good. So why do I mention these things? Well, because these are also excellent principles for life. These are really, really good guidelines for community in uncertain times. And these are uncertain times. Climate change, mental health, inflation, oligarchy, biodiversity loss, nationalism, wars, pandemics, AI, food security, everything right down to our shrinking groceries. But nobody comes to a tiny home show for these, you might be thinking. And I know, it's uncomfortable. It would be easier just to talk about clever cabinets and bird songs. But let's talk resilience for a moment. It's a topic that we probably underplay, and yet it's an undercurrent through so much of the tiny house world, from minimizing clutter and working remotely to sourcing healthy materials and reducing one's eco-footprint. You know, tiny houses can use 11% of the power and 20% of the water that traditional houses do. They cost less, can be placed in unique spots, and can roll out of harm's way if needed. Just last week, the federal government published a blunt foresight report that, among other things, suggested that in an effort to protect mental health, some people might redefine success away from accumulating wealth and toward purposefulness or happiness, that cooperatives may become more common, that forms of person-to-person exchange could become more popular, and small-scale agriculture could increase. I'd like to share with you a model that was first developed by ecologists to explain the life cycle of forests. This infinity loop is called the adaptive cycle, and to me, it's perhaps the most powerfully simple way to describe resilience, both inner resilience and community resilience. More than just bouncing back from adversity, resilience is a loop, constant and in multitudes. Once you see it this way, you'll see it everywhere. In life, relationships, career, industry, projects, and of course, nature. There are 4 phases to the adaptive cycle. Let's start with perhaps the most pleasant one. This is a young forest, a true love, a growing scale-up, a newly elected government, the beginning of a new job. It's the phase where we've found something special and want to run with it. We then progress up the front loop. It's on the front loop that we're strongest, happiest, and most constructive. Life is beautiful on the front loop. The next phase is success, maximized and extended by standardization and optimization. There's comfort with the status quo, but also some signs of complacency and decay. This is an industry's best quarter, an athlete's top performance, a lifetime achievement award, a mature forest. We like this phase so much that we often do everything we can to avoid moving beyond it. We lose adaptive capacity and fall into the rigidity trap. It's here that we see big corporate bailouts, Blockbuster ignoring Netflix, in it for the kids' marriages, climate change denial, proroguing Parliament, and, yes, Enshittification. But all good things eventually come to an end one way or another. There comes a moment of disruption, often not of our choosing: injury, death, breakup, divorce, disaster, recession, revolution, even good things like invention, retirement, or winning the lotto. There was a before and there's an after. Next comes the release phase, when things just fall apart. There's a period of denial and mourning, of coping and confusion. What was isn't and what will hasn't. uncertainty abounds. Then, following some acceptance of a new reality, we try to make sense of our place in it. This can move surprisingly fast or painfully slow, but regardless, beware. The beast is in the back loop. This climb can be very difficult, lonely, and hopeless. The fourth phase is where we begin to regain hope. Exciting possibilities emerge, often many of them. Vegetation pushes through the burnt forest floor. Individuals date, create, and try new things. Startups start up. And here we let 1,000 flowers bloom. Adaptive cycles can be micro and personal, like writing a new song or grieving the loss of a pet. Or they can be macro and global, like the birth of cryptocurrency or the extinction of species. They can move slowly, like human rights movements, or quickly like an improv scene. It feels like humankind is here, doesn't it? At the convergence of multiple disruptive events, socially, economically, politically, and most of all, environmentally. We are immersed in uncertainty, and we should expect some difficult times ahead before seeing the hopeful light of new order at the end of the tunnel. In inner work, often the greatest gifts come from the darkest places. Tough times can bring out the best in us. The only way through is forward, and the only way forward is together. And that's what makes the adaptive cycle such a powerful visual. The front loop crosses the back loop. It's this intersection of the strong and capable with the weak and vulnerable, positions that every one of us is in at various times. That's what makes community an X factor for resilience. When things start to unravel, real communities will reemerge. Author Charles Eisenstein outlines this brilliantly in his book Sacred Economics. And I quote, "If we want to outlast the multiple crises unfolding today, let us not seek to survive them. That is the mindset of separation. That is resistance, a clinging to a dying past, or to a world before midnight. Instead, let us shift our perspective toward reunion and think in terms of what we can give. What can we each contribute to a more beautiful world?" Even if you care mostly in the security of your own future, community is probably the best investment you can make. And that's what Abby and I are doing on 37 beautiful acres in the southern interior of British Columbia. Ready to leave the city behind with the goal of living more sustainably and closer to nature, we set out in 2019 to find a quiet piece of countryside. On our tour of numerous listed properties, we came upon a glorious 37-acre mountainside bench with spring water, spectacular views, a large organic garden, an unfinished post and beam barn loft, and an old homesteader cabin. This peaceful, secluded, and unzoned spot had this meadow just perfect for a human-scale pocket neighborhood. For the last 4 years, we have been developing Big Calm as a permaculture-guided tiny homestead community. We've invested in rebuilding the driveway, in fire protection, community utilities, and this renovated barn loft, which will become a shared community space. We've revived and expanded its organic garden, added a greenhouse, installed rainwater harvesting, as well as a 4,000-liter gravity irrigation system. We've welcomed a handful of tinies. Pictured here are houses by Tree Hugger, Teacup, and Zero Squared, as well as a custom schoolie. And we're just about to open reservations for our second and main phase. 8 full-service tiny house pads available for long-term lease, and the potential for future co-ownership. Not only will these pads include amenities like shared laundry facilities, a tool library, forest trails, and access to the community garden and greenhouse, we're also planning features that support community resilience, such as sheltered hookups to protect connections from the elements. That's your tiny's back loop. A solar microgrid for energy redundancy, a 4-season greenhouse that produces food year-round, and a community root cellar that stores it. We also have many ideas for fun group projects, such as restoring the old forest sauna and building a pond. If any of this interests you, please fill out an expression of interest at bigcalm.ca. More than just a place to park, at Big Calm, we're taking an intentional whole systems approach to building a tiny house community, one that actually maps to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We call it the stack. It starts, of course, with the house and having a roof overhead, probably the main reason you're all here, right? But just as important is the space around that house, the habitat, from hookups to amenities. When one lives tiny, edge space matters. And when one lives rural, you want to interface with nature. You don't want to live in a parking lot. Then there's the people around you. This satisfies a sense of belonging and allows us to do things together that we can't do alone. Learning and sharing skills, cultivating a side hustle, or simply developing hobbies. Remember hobbies? These build esteem. Eisenstein calls this living in the gift, and improvisers practice this by exchanging gifts to create successful scenes together. And finally, connections with other communities, regionally and bioregionally, for knowledge exchange and mutual aid. And that's the stack. We refer to Big Calm as being permaculture guided. What's that mean? Well, permaculture is an approach to land management and settlement design that adopts arrangements observed in flourishing natural ecosystems. There are some permaculture principles embedded in the stack framework, such as zones, which is working efficiently outwards from where you are, and stacking functions. Things are interrelated and serve multiple purposes. And edges. Edges in ecosystems occur where two ecologies meet and where the most interesting events take place. The edge is where it's at. One edge is the vocational type that bridges between the community and the wider world. Whether it's workshops, market produce, or something else, we're being mindful to make space for activities that can fulfill both practically and spiritually, and which can create a powerful microeconomy with close-to-home income. Happy money. We've also observed the edge effect at the interface between house and homestead. For traditional builds, a contractor typically handles both the foundation and structure. However, in a prefab paradigm, the home builder and the landowner are usually independent, and that creates a gap. Too often, four-season tiny houses on wheels are relegated to inadequate campground hookups, and valuable peripheral space becomes an expensive afterthought. In hundreds of conversations we've learned everybody needs skirting and everybody wants decking. So we're working on leveling up the lowly pad. Lastly, I'll tie this all together using permaculture's three overarching principles. Earth care, nurturing nature and minimizing our ecological impact, something tinies do well. People care, ensuring the well-being of others and knowing they too have your back. And fair share, reinvesting surplus, energy, produce, time, reinvesting those into resilience. Now is the time to invest in these things, to trade up and find real community. So that's the vision and the guiding principles behind Big Calm, our tiny homestead village in the Kootenays. I'll leave you with this lovely quote from Bill Mollison, one of the founders of permaculture. Though the problems of the world are increasingly complex, the solutions remain embarrassingly simple. Do what you can with what you have. Live tiny, reconnect with nature, and share your gifts with community. Come join us at Big Calm Tiny Homesteads.